Thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of the book Atheist Delusions by David Bentley Hart from my atheist perspective. In this video, I'm going to cover chapters 3, 4, and 5 of the book. So let's get started right away by beginning part 2 of the book, which is titled The Mythology of the Secular Age, Modernity's Rewriting of the Christian Past, and chapter 3, Faith and Reason. Hart begins the chapter with a lengthy response to a quote that he shares by Jacques Le Goff, the author of Medieval Civilization. In the quote, Le Goff describes the ambiguous attitude displayed toward the sick and the needy by Christians during the medieval period. As Le Goff sees it, Christians of the time extended charity to those in need, but they did so in order to reassure themselves of their own goodness. They used the plight of the sick and the needy as an opportunity for them to live out the desires of Christ and to live out the teachings of the church, to help the less fortunate and to show what good, selfless, charitable Christians they were. And Hart takes issue with this, first making light of Le Goff's apparent ability to read the minds and determine the motives of people who lived and died centuries ago, which is a fair point, and then launching into an impassioned and verbose defense of medieval Christian charity, a brief portion of which I will share with you now. Quote, "There was, after all, a long tradition of Christian monastic hospitals for the destitute and dying, going back to the days of Constantine and stretching from the Syrian and Byzantine East to the western fringes of Christendom, a tradition that had no real precedent in pagan society, unless one counts, say, the valetudinaria used by the military to restore soldiers to fighting form." And then Hart lists a series of Christians who established centers to care for the sick from the 4th century up through the 13th, suggesting that perhaps we ought to take these charitable works at face value and not attach to them a negative judgment about the society to which they belonged. And again, this isn't such an unreasonable suggestion. History is open to this kind of interpretation. We can't possibly know that medieval Christians engaged in charity only to ease their own consciences or to make a show of their own goodness. Though the opposite is true as well, and we should be careful when attributing only pure and benevolent motives to such people as well. Hart's purpose in bringing this up is not to argue for a more nuanced view of history or to emphasize the complexity of the motivations for medieval Christian charity, although he is doing that, and that is to his credit. Instead, he wants to make sure that Christianity gets all the credit for introducing the notion of selflessness and care for the sick to pagan Europe. He says, quote, "Even the most ardent secularists among us generally cling to notions of human rights, economic and social justice, providence for the indigent, legal equality, or basic human dignity that pre-Christian Western culture would have found not so much foolish as unintelligible." Let's focus on that providence for the indigent bit and the notion that Christianity is responsible for getting medieval Europeans to care for the sick and the needy. I do think it's interesting that Hart seems to want to credit the church, and above that the example of Christ, with establishing the concepts of human rights and social justice, when it took one full millennium and nearly 3/4 of another one after the time of Christ for those concepts to catch on with a significant number of his followers. I mean, I remind you, David Bentley Hart has said earlier on in this book, and I presume he will get into this in more detail, much more laborious detail as we get later into the book, but he doesn't think the Enlightenment is any big deal. He doesn't think the reforms of the Enlightenment are all they have been cracked up to be by modern folks. So if the Enlightenment was no big deal, and if the Enlightenment ideals were not so revolutionary and were in fact carried just fine by Christendom up until that point, and were even done much better by Christians prior to the Enlightenment, how is it that it took until the 18th century for people to start speaking seriously about ending the institution of slavery in the West? Because I remind you, when I say the 18th century, we start counting with Jesus. So it took 1,800 years from the time of Jesus to the time when the abolition of slavery actually caught on and became a significant political movement in the West. And if that movement was the result not of some change in thinking or priorities brought about by the Enlightenment, but rather was purely just an expression of Christian principles that had been there all along, how is it that it took 18 centuries from the time of Jesus for people following Jesus and supposedly motivated by the example and the teachings of Jesus to figure out that that's what Jesus wanted them to do, that Jesus wouldn't have been cool with slavery? I just don't see how this makes any sense at all. But maybe it'll make more sense when we get to that part of the book. I'm sort of jumping ahead of it, but that just really bothers me that he says, oh, you know, the credit should all go to Christianity. These are Christian principles, and no other institution and no other aspect of culture deserves to have any sort of credit for bringing about social reforms or for introducing people to concepts of human rights and social justice and social equality. These are all Christian principles. We get all this from Jesus. Really? Well, Jesus probably could have done a better job of explaining that those would be his priorities then, don't you think? If it took his followers 1,800 years to work that out. Anyway, I digress. Let's talk about Christian charity. Hart seems to believe that were it not for Christianity, the Western world would not have made caring for the less fortunate a priority. He scoffs at what he calls the modern notion that social morality would inevitably have evolved to the point where things like hospitals and places providing provisions for the poor and the hungry were established. To Hart, the influence of Christ and of the church founded to worship him was absolutely necessary for these things to happen. Well, if Hart wants to credit the medieval church for its charitable works, I am actually not compelled to fight him over that. My understanding is that the church did a great deal of work to help the poor, and that under Christian influence, efforts to bring some treatment to the sick and to bring some relief to the poor greatly expanded compared to the pre-Christian era. Fantastic. But let's not indulge in this fantasy Hart presents, where there was no such thing as charity before the Christians came along. One way in which Hart is being extremely selective, and I feel a little dishonest, when citing evidence for his case becomes apparent almost immediately. He's referring only to the West. He talks about the expansion of hospitals and charity in Europe. He doesn't mention that in India, Hindus were building hospitals and charity houses at least 100 years before the time of Jesus, perhaps a good deal sooner than that. He doesn't mention that the oldest hospitals ever discovered anywhere in the world are not in Christian Europe, but in Sri Lanka. He certainly doesn't mention that Christianity's teachings about the importance of caring for the sick and the poor, while admirable, are hardly unique. Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Sikhism, Jainism, and numerous other faiths all impress upon their followers the importance of giving of one's own wealth and labor to help the less fortunate. These may be Christian principles, but they are not, as Hart continues to insist, exclusively Christian principles or even originally Christian principles. It just simply isn't true that Christianity made up all of this stuff about caring for the less fortunate. But as if that's not bad enough for Hart's position, he fails to do justice to pre-Christian Europe as well. While it's fair to observe that charity and medical care did expand under Christian authority, the notion of providing for the welfare of the sick and those in need originated in Rome during the reign of Emperor Augustus, who died before Jesus would have been born. And there were facilities dedicated to caring for the sick in ancient Greece hundreds of years before that. Just as he did in the previous chapters when attempting to claim universal human values as the exclusive property of Christianity, Hart overreaches here in trying to credit Christianity, and only Christianity, for teaching people the importance of charity and social welfare. They didn't need the example of Christ to learn those values in India, or China, or Egypt, or even in ancient Greece and pre-Christian Rome. A major part of Hart's thesis is that the Enlightenment not only was less than it is cracked up to be, but actually led to the devaluing of humanity by compelling people to turn from the church that had taught them to value it in the first place. But how little must Hart think of humanity, or at least that bit of it living in Europe 2,000 years ago, if he believes people had to be told by the church to take care of the sick and the poor? And how can he honestly argue that the level of care and empathy directed at the less fortunate today, post-Enlightenment, is inferior to that of several centuries in the past? It's not as if Hart is arguing that everything was human rights and scientific advancement during the medieval period. No, in fact, he says, quote, "Admittedly, the early Middle Ages were a surpassingly harsh period in Western European history. As the Western Roman world gradually dissolved, there was a prolonged period when many of the achievements of classical antiquity were largely lost in the Christian West, though not in the Christian East, and the monasteries became the sole repositories of what remained of ancient learning." Sure, okay, the Middle Ages were pretty bad, but don't you go saying that we're more literate and enlightened now than we were then. That's not what Hart is actually saying, to be fair. He's not arguing that modern people are less enlightened than people living in the Middle Ages, but his writing has the peculiar effect of making it seem like that's what he's saying, until he makes it clear that he is not, in fact, saying that. He goes on and on and on and on and on about how people in the Middle Ages were actually far more enlightened than we think they are today. And whenever he mentions modernity, it's always in a negative fashion. It's always to denigrate modernity. And then he'll come in with something at the very end and say, oh no, I'm not saying that modern times are that bad. I'm not saying that the medieval period was all that great. So, okay, I guess that's your point. So what is his point? What is he actually saying? Well, so far his most important point seems to be that things were less backwards in the medieval period than we have come to believe they were, and that the reason they weren't as bad as they could have been is the Christian church, which, as I've said a couple times already, isn't such an unreasonable statement. Until we remember that Hart is also saying that only the Christian church could have provided such a positive influence, that no other institution, even in theory, would have been capable of presiding over the often overlooked development of society and science that occurred during those years. And that's where Hart crosses over from being a reasonable person making an argument for nuance to an apologist. Let's move on from chapter 3 to chapter 4, which is titled The Night of Reason. Is that the party that they're having after the Reason Rally, the Night of Reason? Hart devotes most of this chapter to an attempt to refute the common charge that Christians were primarily responsible for the destruction of the library at Alexandria. In the first place, the library destroyed during the Christian era was not the Great Library of Alexandria. That library was actually burned centuries before, during the reign of Julius Caesar. The structure destroyed in the late 4th century was the Serapeum, which had housed a daughter library to the original Great Library at Alexandria. But Hart insists that there is no evidence that there was a library at the Serapeum at the time of its destruction. In the second place, the destruction of the Serapeum took place during an incredibly contentious and violent period in Alexandrian history. Pagans and Christians had been fighting one another for decades. Here's how Hart describes the destruction of the Serapeum at Alexandria. Quote, "When the temple of Serapis, that is the Serapeum, was razed, however, Theodosius I, AD 347 to 395, was emperor. For most of his reign, he tolerated pagans and did not exclude them from high office, as Julian had excluded Christians. But in 381 and 382, he issued or reinstituted laws forbidding sacrifices and making it illegal even to enter pagan temples for purposes of worship. In Alexandria, where nothing was ever done by half measures and no difference was ever peacefully resolved, the implacable patriarch Theophilus was apparently all too eager to turn the vacant sanctuaries to holier uses, and this eagerness seems to have begun the chain of events that ended in the Serapeum's destruction." And Hart goes on to describe how, under orders from Theophilus, who was the bishop of Alexandria at the time, Christians exhumed human remains while excavating beneath an empty pagan temple. This enraged the pagans, who saw this as a desecration. A riot ensued, and ultimately a group of pagans took Christian hostages and retreated to the Serapeum, where the captured Christians were reportedly tortured and murdered. After this incident, Emperor Theodosius ordered that the Serapeum be demolished. So, to recap, riots ensued in Alexandria after Theodosius, a Christian, essentially outlawed paganism, and Bishop Theophilus, also a Christian, oversaw the desecration of a pagan temple. Ultimately, the Serapeum was destroyed at the order of Theodosius, who, I remind you, was a Christian, but according to Hart, it's not fair to blame the Christians for the destruction of the Serapeum. And why is that? Well, because pretty much everyone back then was an asshole. Quote, "I doubt we would much like any of these people. Not to be glib, but it was a very different age, one in which blood flowed fairly copiously in the streets, and almost everyone believed that supernatural forces were constantly at work in nature and beyond it. As for the failure of many of the Christians of the time to transcend their circumstances, it is enough to observe that it is easier to baptize a culture than to change it." I mean, cut him some slack. Come on. And I'm willing to cut him some slack, actually. Unlike Hart, who argues that Christianity, and only Christianity, was or ever could have been responsible for the rise of Western learning and civilization, I do not wish to argue the inverse, that Christianity, and only Christianity, was or ever could have been such an enemy to learning and to the civilizations and cultures of non-Christians. But that doesn't change the fact that it was the Christian church that was responsible for the destruction of the Serapeum. The Christian church was very often a powerful and destructive enemy of the learning and civilizations and cultures of non-Christians. No amount of equivocating or desperately asserting just how complicated things were back then absolves the church and the Christians of that time of their responsibility for their deeds. And honestly, I think it's a little sleazy and a little slimy the way Hart subtly tries to inject things into his writing and into his depiction of these events to take some of the guilt away from Theodosius and Theophilus. Let's go back to that quote that I shared a moment ago, where he is describing how Theodosius, for the most part, he tolerated pagans, and he didn't exclude them from high office like Julian had excluded the Christians. So Theodosius might not have been great, but he wasn't as bad as Julius. Julius excluded Christians, let's not forget. Theodosius didn't do that to the pagans, for a while anyway. And when he gets to Theophilus, apparently Theophilus, he was just too eager. He was just too eager to turn the vacant pagan temples to holier uses. Note the language. He's assuming that Theophilus's view of turning the pagan temples into some Christian use, that's the holier purpose. He's subtly absolving them, or at least mitigating their sins, taking a little bit of their guilt away for their crimes. Yeah, sure, technically they were responsible for destroying the Serapeum. Technically they were responsible for doing these things, for suppressing pagan worship, but they had their hearts in the right place, and they weren't as bad as some of those pagans had been to Christians in the past, and they were just a little too eager. They were so holy and they were so determined to promote Christianity that maybe they went a little overboard, but can we really blame them? Hart continues, quote, "The shocking and horrifying stories are plentiful, of course, and tend to fix themselves in memory. But over the most prolonged periods of change, the slow transformation of the empire from pagan to Christian was effected without much violence, and even without great disruption to the rhythm of life. And while it is correct to deplore Christians whose behavior betrayed the morality of the faith they professed, it is also worth noting that one cannot do the same where the pagans devoted to the temple cults are concerned, since their religions had practically no morality to betray." Once again, the assumption that the Christians are better than the pagans. Yes, the Christians did some bad things, but they weren't as bad as those awful, immoral pagans. It's better to have Christians committing atrocities than to have pagans committing atrocities, because at least Christians have a religion that tells them not to commit atrocities. The flaw in Hart's logic is that I'm fairly certain the Christians who took part in the acts depicted in some of those shocking and horrifying stories Hart references did not view their actions as betraying the morality of their faith. David Bentley Hart, looking back from his more enlightened and, dare I say, modern position, may view their actions that way, but throughout history, devout followers of all religions who were guilty of terrible crimes believed their deeds were justified and even compelled by their faiths. For Hart to declare that those Christians betrayed the morality of their faith is to do the same thing he accuses modern non-Christians of doing: place the morality he recognizes above the morality recognized by those Christians in the past. And something tells me, just from the tone with which he describes the events, that David Bentley Hart would not consider the Christian emperor and the Christian bishop of Alexandria outlawing someone else's religion, outlawing paganism, and attempting to reclaim pagan temples for Christian uses. I don't think he would consider that to be a shocking and horrifying thing. But to me, and maybe it's just my modern sensibility, but that to me is an outrageous, offensive thing for the leader of one particular religion who happens to be in political power to use that political power to outlaw the religion of other people, as those Christians did in Alexandria, as told to us by David Bentley Hart. I find that utterly outrageous and offensive and inexcusable. David Bentley Hart doesn't seem to feel that way about it. He may disapprove of it. He may acknowledge that that's not the way things ought to be done. He may acknowledge that, yes, we need to respect the rights of other people to worship or not worship as they see fit. But he doesn't seem nearly as outraged, nearly as offended by the concept of Christian leaders outlawing other people's religion in their domain as perhaps he might be, or perhaps he would be if the same offense was committed against, say, a group of Christians. Hart closes this chapter with another lengthy argument against what he calls the many romances that have sprung up over the centuries about the death of Hypatia, depicting her as a martyr to knowledge murdered by Christians who hated her for being an educated woman. The actual reason she was killed, Hart says, is probably because she inadvertently found herself embroiled in a conflict between two rival factions in Alexandria at the time. And perhaps this is the case. Personally, my knowledge of Hypatia is very superficial, and I'm not capable of making an informed response to what Hart says here. But here's what troubles me about his argument in general. If his point was to say that history is very much more complex than its popular depictions, I would agree. If his point were that history is far more complicated than pagans valued science and diversity, but Christians hated and feared both, I would also agree. But that's not his point. His point includes both of those assertions, but adds along with them the insistence that there is something uniquely enlightened and moral about Christianity, an enlightenment and morality that is to be credited for the social progress that occurred under Christian influence, but is in no way to be tarnished by the persecution and other crimes committed by the church or by individual Christians during the same era. That is apologist horseshit at its finest, and I just can't get behind that. Moving on to chapter 5, the destruction of the past. After spending much of the last chapter absolving Christians of destroying the library at Alexandria, Hart devotes this chapter to arguing that Christians deserve the credit for preserving and eventually renewing knowledge about the drama and philosophy of classical antiquity during the Middle Ages, something which is typically credited to Islamic scholars. Yes, Hart admits Muslims and Arab Christians did play an important role in preserving the works of the great classical writers, after they obtained those works by conquering the Christians who had preserved them in the first place. Quote, "Much more ought to be said, really, if one is to adequately describe the extraordinarily complex history of the late medieval movement of the texts of Greek antiquity into the Christian West. What is important to stress here, however, is what a crude burlesque of medieval history it is to speak of a miraculous retreat of a Christian dark ages of obscurantism, stagnation, and terror before the cleansing gales of Islamic civilization. And Hart goes on to credit Eastern Christianity with preserving our classical inheritance, which then was passed to their Muslim conquerors. But even though Western Christendom lost its connection to that inheritance for a few centuries, Hart insists it isn't fair to say that Christians willfully destroyed the works of pagan writers. To the contrary, pagan writers were studied by Christian scholars and kept in the libraries of Christian monasteries for centuries. So why were they eventually lost in the West? Quote, pagan and Christian emperors both occasionally destroyed books, it cannot be denied, books of divination, magic, and forbidden religions primarily, and no one was quite as sentimental about the preservation of knowledge as we are today. Throughout the Christian period, obviously, as was true during the pagan period as well, innumerable and other precious texts disappeared through inattention, indifference, mishap, political upheaval, riot, warfare, invasion, plunder, or mere forgetfulness. Also, the fragility of ink and paper during this time, natural disasters, the quite understandable tendency of Christians to copy Christian works before pagan ones, and a bunch of other reasons for which Christianity cannot be blamed. So says David Bentley Hart. Here's my issue with what Hart is saying. Even if I agree with his very charitable depiction of Christianity's treatment of pagan literature during the Middle Ages, I can't help but notice that the loss of those ancient classics was obviously not inevitable. And how do I know that? Because much of that which was lost in the West was preserved in the East, first by the Eastern Christians and then by the Muslims. It was possible for them to hold on to the classics because they chose to do so. And if that is true, why should the Christians of the West be absolved of their responsibility? Oh, sure, no one back then was as interested in preserving the writings of the past as we are today. Christians who did study the classics tended to invent reasons for why it was acceptable for them to do so. For instance, crediting ancient Jewish scholars with providing the original inspiration for ideas since credited to Greek philosophers and mathematicians. So that made it okay. The Greeks were just repeating the learning of the ancient Jews, and we like the ancient Jews. They wrote the Old Testament. Or studying the classics with the intention of taking away anything compatible with Christianity and elevating it and sanctifying it while discarding the so-called earthly bits from the pagan learning. Christian writings, scriptures, and works by early church leaders were prioritized over those of the classical philosophers. And the longer the Christian church was in charge, the more overt its disdain for the classics became. Studying sacred Christian writings was always encouraged, while studying works of pagan origin was gradually discouraged and eventually, in certain cases, even forbidden altogether. Why were there more classics preserved in the East? Well, maybe that's because of the connection to the old Roman Empire, which remained very much stronger in the East, though we refer to that civilization today as the Byzantine Empire, pardon me. People who lived there at the time called it the Roman Empire, and they thought of themselves as Romans, even though they lived far from the city of Rome. Therefore, the knowledge and traditions of Rome and of Greece were afforded more respect and allowed more influence. There was a continuity with the knowledge of the past that was maintained in the East and which was eventually abandoned in the West. And I think it would be reasonable to say that the West was the worse off for it. Does Hart consider it a coincidence that the reintroduction of those lost classics to the West was soon followed by the beginning of the Renaissance? Or does he consider the Renaissance to be just as overrated as the Enlightenment? Or I suppose we might find that out in the next video, because that is it for this video. That is it for my coverage of these 3 chapters. In the next video in this series, I will return to review Chapter 6, The Death and Rebirth of Science, and Chapter 7, Intolerance and Persecution. I bet that one will be about something other than what it seems to be about, huh? Anyway, that's it for me this week, folks. Thank you as always for watching. Thank you for finding this to be of some use and some interest. If anything I have said here today provokes a response, positive or negative, agreeable or disagreeable, if you think I've got something really right, or you think I've got something really wrong, if you're a Christian or an atheist or something else entirely, I welcome your comments. Please leave a comment. Let me know what you think. If you enjoyed this video, also please consider liking it, sharing it, subscribing to the channel if you're not subbed already, and most importantly of all, please consider helping me to make more videos like this one by supporting this channel and supporting this work I do through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives to become a patron of this channel. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.